welcome to the first episode of Pop Matters. I'm your host, Professor Lincoln Geraghty, and each month we'll be looking at popular culture matters and if they matter, from comics to sci-fi to all things fan-based. This month I have joining me Dr. David Garland, Course Leader for Media Studies, Dr. Van Norris, Senior Lecturer in Film and Media Animation Studies, and Dr. Alexander Sargent, Lecturer in Film and Media Studies. This episode we discuss Disney's Marvel TV series and the MCU. So, welcome all. Now, we just want to start each episode with a quick roundup of popular culture in the news, with each of our guests bringing something to the table, a section we're calling Pop News Matters. I'll start, I think, take liberties as host, because it's a really important matter. This week we found out that Channel 5 is no longer funding Neighbours production, and there is a huge campaign on social media to #SaveNeighbours. And as a long-term fan, I've been fully supporting this, tweeting, and I even bought the Neighbours soundtrack on iTunes this morning, trying to get that to #1 to big up the reasons to save it. Any thoughts?
About Neighbours?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm surprised it's still going, if I'm honest. I haven't got a lot of investment in it. I'm sorry about that. But I know that it's still popular with some... What the sort of ratings like?
Channel 5 was still getting 1.5 million viewers for the episodes. To be fair, only 100,000 in Australia watch it every night.
Okay.
So it's mainly a British show made in Australia.
It's a curious thing, isn't it? Because it kind of speaks to that broader kind of British obsession with all things Aussie and the kind of interchange between the two cultures, but it's always been very much a kind of we love it much more than the Aussies seem to like it. So it's interesting that it seems to have survived and yet is still forever in trouble. It seems to be both relevant and never relevant at the same time, Neighbours.
Yeah, I sort of grew up with it and stuck with it really, and still watch it every day. David, any thoughts?
Well, it's the whole exotic thing, right? The Australians loved ABBA more than the Swedish, so yeah, I thought Kylie Minogue was still on it, so I really haven't been following
Close.
it. So,
Paul and Jane are still on it, or they left and came back.
Maybe Home and Away could join them. They could get like a shared universe going.
Yes, and we're talking about Marvel multiverse later, so they could have an Australian Salt multiverse.
And also the point we're making, you know, these Home and Away Neighbours, they breed, maybe that's not the right word, but they create a factory for like new stars. Quite a lot of like Hollywood stars have come out of those shows, right?
Absolutely, big up Margot Robbie. There'd be no Harley Quinn in the DC universe without Neighbours, because Margot Robbie started on the show. But maybe if I can turn to David and say, what news have you found interesting this week?
well, I found interesting Sony's latest response in the tit for tat with Microsoft as a game studio buying Bungie in retaliation for Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard, and it seems nowadays it's content is king. It's no longer about who has the best hardware, and you really want the customers to shell out and buy both consoles, so you can get exclusives, I think, on the console. And I think the Sony thing bites hard because that's where Halo was developed for Microsoft. Even though Microsoft still owned the game, it must be, right piercing the heart of Microsoft.
How much money have they spent on that then?
I think it's 3.6 billion or something like that.
Just
I mean, it's big business,
loose change
right?
then.
Yeah, much bigger than the movie industry now.
Yeah, I'm not a particular gamer, but
I'm not
how will this affect sort of film production and sort of adaptations, do you think?
Well, so my understanding with these kind of video gaming sharing platforms, they haven't quite gone down the kind of film audio kind of production of letting it be free but you pay a subscription rate. It seems to be one of the few things that you have to spend quite a lot of money on still to get the latest product. He says as someone that last played Super Mario 64 and then thought that's probably where video games will will end.
But of course, the downloadable content and the kind of extra missions or extra content, that's the way that those console games and PC games get more money in, really.
So, Van, not a gamer, but you're
Not at
very
all.
into film. Any news from you this week?
I suppose there isn't much more pop matters than the Oscars, the Oscar nominations, which are, I've got a list of some of the best films here. Power of the Dog, Best Picture nomination, West Side Story, Belfast, Dune, Licorice Pizza, King Richard, Coda, Don't Look Up, Drive My Car and Nightmare Alley.
Who do you think will win?
Personally, I think it's probably going to be Belfast or Power of the Dog. I think those two look like the most certain because they're sort of Oscar-worthy, aren't they? They're earnest stories about quite intense subjects, usually a lot of emotional resonance. Belfast in particular, because Kenneth Branagh is a favourite with the Academy, and he's constructed this very cinematic kind of elegy to Northern Ireland in black and white, which has got Oscar nomination written all over it. Really.
Yeah. No love for sci-fi and fantasy though. Only Dune there.
I would love to see Dune get it, but I think it's because it's a science fiction movie.
Yeah.
I think also because as well it's a part one.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
So I wonder if that might impact on the.
Feels like the kind of fan service nomination.
Very
to
much
me.
so.
I mean, we're talking about sort of, pop matters. Do the Oscars matter as much to pop culture as they used to do? Is Mike? I mean, I care less and less each year. I think there's some good films in it, but whether they're the films that matter to people the most is an interesting question. Yeah.
I mean, they're sort of starting to build in Netflix releases now more. They've kind of acknowledged that Netflix is now a thing, and that's how people engage with most cinema, especially smaller budget films, of course, such as Power of the Dog, for example.
Yeah. No nomination for Best Picture for Spider-Man, which sort of reaped all the sort of profits.
Or Bond.
Or Bond, yes. No love for
technical,
Daniel
really,
Craig.
Special effects, I think.
They give the technical awards to these kind of fan service items, and they might give one a Dune, a Nolan movie, something like that, the nomination, mainly to, I'm assuming, to get people to watch it on the night more than any other kind of reason. But it seems to be that the films that win are your Nomadlands. I think Power of the Dog's probably for Oscars, but I think Belfast is not a bad shout either. I guess West Side Story is the only.
Oh yes.
But
Spielberg.
It's been a misfire, isn't it? Really?
It's been a misfire commercially, but I think critically it was very well received. And Spielberg, cinema, in a year where cinema's really struggling, I wonder a big zhuzhy cinematic thing like West Side Story. It's quite culturally relevant. It's kind of engaging with kind of really important racial tensions through an old lens. So I don't know, but I think money's on Power of the Dog.
I think with Spielberg as well, it might be a case that they're trying to kind of give Spielberg a nod because he must be getting towards the end of his career. So,
Well, if he
I don't know. I think he's going to live forever. But June, noticeably, hasn't had its director nominated, which is a shock. And I noticed all the articles are about shocks, right? When they were announced. And I think, Alex, in terms of technical nominations, I think June and some of the more kind of cult pictures will get a lot of them, but they're often now shown off camera, aren't they? Because it goes on for 3.5 hours, prime time in the US, and it's too long for most people, even the fans.
Well, talking about cult film, you had a news item about an older film rather than the new Oscar-winning films.
Oh yes, I know I'm not supposed to, but I want to talk about Fight Club and whether Fight Club is the subversive, damaging, anti-communist parable that the Chinese government seem to think of it as. If people aren't familiar with it, it kind of had an ending stuck on the end of it by the Chinese censors, basically saying the plot didn't work, everyone went back to their normal citizenship, and normality ensued as a kind of prologue, and then now there was a backlash against that, and now the Chinese government, oddly, which is not normally what they would do, has taken that stamp back off it. So I guess it raises an interesting question about censorship, about globalism versus kind of nationalism and how you approach these things. I also think it raises an interesting question about Fight Club that's been going since the beginning, which is, what is Fight Club about? Because I think you can read Fight Club as a very subversive, anti-capitalist, anti-communist, anti-masculine, but you can also read it as an extremely problematic right-wing. It's courted both readings, so it's an interesting film to suddenly realise we care about after all these years.
Well, I think that's probably why it's prevalent. It's because people, each successive generation, map their own meaning onto it.
Yeah,
they kind of see what they want to see in it. Absolutely. That's why some of Ridley Scott's early films have done so well, is because he was very vague in nailing down a meaning, and you feel that's the same with Fight Club. You can interpret that. But
I remember when Dirty Harry came out, a lot of people thought it was a secret left-wing film, and they still thought that until Clint Eastwood revealed his true colours politically, I think. But a lot of people suggested maybe they wanted to like it. That's the thing. They liked the technical aspect and how well it was made, so they couldn't bear to think it was like Death Wish or something.
Sure.
So lots of news going on, and there's plenty more, from TV to film to the Oscars. And that takes us nicely on to our main topic of today, really, where we're going to be talking about Disney's Marvel TV series and the MCU. Now, we have 3 guests here to talk about. They're all experts in comics, pop culture and television. I want to turn to, I believe, Van first. Now, there's been a lot of TV on Disney Plus recently. Marvel is big. Where does it all fit into what's been happening in the last 15 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
Well, we're in phase 4 now officially, and I think what we're seeing now is a much more convoluted set of stories. I'm guessing, looking at the way the films are stacked up and the way the television is stacked up, that the end result is going to be the Fantastic Four, which has been reclaimed from 20th Century Fox. So you kind of get the sense of what we're seeing here are the kind of the sort of the foundation for the world of the Fantastic Four. And it's interesting. I mean, I think you've got things like, which seem very disparate shows. Loki, we've seen what was it, Captain America and the Winter Soldier. We've seen WandaVision, Hawkeye. We've got Moon Knight coming out soon, which looks really interesting. We've got She-Hulk, Miss Marvel, Secret Wars, Armor Wars. We've got a Secret Invasion and Armor Wars. We've got Ironheart. So there's a real sense that they're just kind of blowing the universe apart and trying to hit as many points possible. It could be that buried within each of those, as I say, is the kind of foundation for where we go. The implication also is that the X-Men, who also have been retrieved from 20th Century Fox, will be the basis for Phase 5. But we don't know, there's all speculation. But it strikes me that there's something interesting going on with the multiverse, with time travel, with the quantum verse, which is a feature of the third Ant-Man movie. We've seen Kang appear, Kang the Conqueror, who's a time traveller appear in Loki, which implies, I don't want to get into canon, because I know other people are talking about that perhaps we might get Doctor Doom, which means the Fantastic Four. So we could be seeing the beginnings of that, yeah.
Potential overload, though? Too much? As you said, there's an explosion of television, but, what do people watch? Do we have to watch all of them?
It's interesting, because, I mean, like my partner watches them with me, She's a very patient woman. And she basically says, I don't understand what's going on. Yeah. And I thought, well, she's far from a stupid person, And I think if that's happening now, is that the point where maybe it's going too fast and we're covering too much ground? I don't know.
That's why Guardians of the Galaxy initially was so successful. It seemed so separate from everything else to begin with.
Very much so.
It also seems to me that with these television series and the film, they want to keep the films as a kind of event in and of themselves, but they also want the television to kind of support the films. So it feels like it's this weird situation where the narratives have to matter a lot in terms of the individual narratives to keep these 10-part series going, whilst at the same time not really mattering a huge amount to the wider chain of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because they are quite aware that not everybody is going to watch everything. Some people are going to dip into some of them, and they've got to still keep those people on side whilst appealing to the hardcore fan base, which makes me think that we're getting more and more content and less matters out of it.
Yeah, I wonder that. I wonder if what we're doing is seeing basically Easter eggs being collected.
Yeah.
But each show is something that is going to get referred to later on one of the films, and then fans go, "Oh, wonderful! Look, they mentioned it." I don't know, but it does. Yeah, I think it seems a bit. It always feels as well a little bit, and I mean, I sound like I'm being really down on it. I'm not, So I enjoyed Hawkeye. Looking forward very much to She-Hulk and Moon Knight. But I do wonder if it's the sense that we're constantly this cycle of really watching adverts for other things. You're constantly this sense of deferment. Well, this is great, but what we've got coming up is the Black Knight and Blade. And we've got all these other wonderful films, and you feel like you're just permanently out of grasp.
And there's loads of comic history to rely on, of course. So it's potentially endless that Disney could go on forever just churning out new TV series.
Absolutely.
Which for fans would be great, but where does the narrative end?
Yeah, and if you throw them into this kind of structure of multiverses where anybody can be anything in any world and characters can die and come back to a life in a different realm, and we've already seen that happen with the time traveling elements of it does get to a point where you're like, okay, so everything could happen, everything might happen, but nothing that does happen has any consequence anymore because, you know, and I go back to kind of, you know, not to spoil the kind of cultural moment of the last sort of decade, but the moments in the Marvel franchise where things get serious, you also are quite aware in that moment there's the potential for things to get very unserious very quickly,
right,
and for IPs, to use that word again, kind of to rear their ugly head, and you look at the release schedules, and the release schedules are becoming spoilers, like let alone you know, narrative investment anymore. It feels like that, so it's a delicate balancing act, but some good stuff I still think out there. I mean, I thought WandaVision was very good, in particular, and used the television format very well.
Yeah,
on,
and good
on
concept,
the platform.
good central concept. Yeah.
Yeah, WandaVision seemed to be very reverential to TV rather than linking back to the films, and of course you had the sort of strong sort of reflection on American suburban life and the sort of nostalgia for old TV, right?
Yeah, and as we were watching it initially, remember, we didn't know it was going to be into the whole Marvel mythology and wider universe. We thought it might just be a new sitcom every week with the characters kind of referring to them in a very meta, intertextual way. But I do notice, interestingly, in terms of the films and the TV shows, it's obviously Kevin Feige now controlling everything, as opposed to that.
The split between Isaac
and that led to some hurt feelings, particularly on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where they were told they had to wait to do this big twist until it. What was it? The Robert Redford Captain America
That's
film,
right, yeah.
Winter Soldier,
yeah, and the
Winter Soldier.
Hydra and all of that going on, and then later they didn't even get benefit from that because it was suggested by many people that the show wasn't canon. It wasn't part of the MCU anyway, and that's still a thorn in the side of fans of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
I can well imagine. Yeah, there's been, because they were told it was initially, and it was sold as that. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, David, canon, you know, it's not the first time Marvel has been on TV, of course, and Netflix, the sort of, I guess, Disney Plus's competitor, had a whole series of Marvel TV series. How do they fit into this wider canon that Disney is creating?
Well, just like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. that came before that, it is a thorny question, but I think with Netflix shows, they seem to be incorporating them slowly, maybe not all of them and wholesale, into the MCU and into what's going on in not just the Disney Plus series, but also the films. We had the appearance, didn't we, of Matt Murdock from Daredevil and Spider-Man as the lawyer that you would turn to in that area. And then I think even more interestingly, we had the Kingpin suddenly arrive in Hawkeye.
That's right.
And there's huge debate about whether it's the same Kingpin or a different Kingpin, and whether they had to do it differently, or they could, have exactly the same character, and if that was to do with some contractual obligations that it had to be so much different, a bit like Star Trek, right? And the new Star Trek. And in terms of Kingpin, I know that Vincent D'Onofrio has responded and said, no, it's the same
it's the same
Kingpin,
guy,
but others have said, but he seems too powerful, he seems too invulnerable, he dresses differently. And then, again, a riposte would be, he's got the same cufflinks as in the original Daredevil, so he must be the same person. And this, I guess it matters to people. It really does matter to people whether what they've loved is part of the MCU or not, and whether these characters could make the crossover.
I mean,
because if they can, it could be Jessica Jones next, it could be Luke Cage.
I have no doubt that Iron Fist is going to have a walk-on cameo
very
in
brief,
Avengers
judging by
5.
the success of the
It's gonna
show.
That means I have to watch them.
Well, it's all about nostalgia, isn't it? And the canon thing is great because it's about storytelling, but it's also nostalgia. And this is a little bit why I'm a bit sceptical, cynical, I don't know what the word is really, in terms of where they are at the moment with this multiverse thing. As you say it, the stakes are reduced, but also we're at the point where, nothing really matters, and it just, what we're doing is always reminding everyone not only what's yet to come, but how good it was and how we can never make it as good again. And that worries me a little bit.
Well, I think nostalgia depends particularly on the generation. For people, of my age, it's nostalgia for the comic books and how they've. But for people younger, it becomes nostalgia just for earlier movies or earlier TV shows. People are already feeling nostalgia for the Netflix shows, which is why I think you know, it matters whether they are going to be cast aside in terms of canon.
Well, they're
on the
about 7
MCU.
years old now, so
Yeah.
they're now nostalgic
Yeah.
artifacts.
And Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. went on 7 years, and there's still
believe
rumours
that.
it might come back. Yeah.
Nostalgia is a really confusing thing when it's used by corporations like this, though, because I think, like I was thinking about this with the new Spider-Man movie. Like, to me, that is like prime targeting. I mean, I'm sure everyone feels this way, but it's targeting me because Tobey Maguire is my Spider-Man. That's the Spider-Man I connect with as a sort of the adolescent within me, and watching him reappear that's a nostalgic fusion of different Spider-Mans. But I've been talking to my students since it came out, and they have a similar nostalgia for that, even though they weren't necessarily around when it was out.
Or if they were impressionable young children, and so it means something more.
Sure, you're sure. And like we have these pop culture items that are almost, they're not necessarily trading on a pre-existing nostalgia, they're creating the nostalgia to begin with. Things like, you know, Stranger Things is nostalgia for the 80s. It's playing much more to, you know, less under 20s than it is playing to people who actually grew up in the 80s.
That's right, just like enjoying the aesthetics.
But there are reaction videos for Stranger Things where, one that I've been watching over the few series where this guy puts up what he was doing at that time in the 80s, you know, and puts connections up to all the movies and makes it a personal narrative for himself.
So he's there
like
and is
that.
like, you know, listening to his Walkman with his, you know, leotard doing sort of
Well, he
stretches.
makes the connections that Stranger Things doesn't even make, you
Right.
know, to other things.
But there's so much plastic in that sense, like you're saying, if you're referring back to a time you never experienced in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed that the Flash, I know we're going off topic because we're into DC world.
Yeah, well,
But
Civil War.
The Flash's entire selling point has been that Michael Keaton will be playing Batman in it.
Yeah.
That's from 1989.
Yeah.
Do many of the audience, I suppose it's TV viewings maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's the main selling point. The film itself is almost like it doesn't exist. It's Michael Keaton is playing Batman. Strange.
Talking about Michael Keaton, what I found fascinating about sort of tying up all these stories, there was an interview that Keaton did, and they asked him, how does he think he's been in the Spider-Man universe, he's now in the Batman universe, and he says, well, I don't know what the hell's going on. I just turn up and read my lines. I don't know how each thing connects. So we've talked a lot about connecting and canon being important. He's just like, well, I
He
just
was
act.
conspicuously absent from the latest Spider-Man film. They didn't bring him in, right?
So he might be in Morbius, we've seen in the trailer.
Yeah, that's the
think he
rumours
is.
that he's doing something else instead.
Which adds to this, like, how does that fit in? Because it's a parallel multiverse sort of aspect.
Well, it's coming, isn't there? There's, I believe they're going to... What's the name of the female character? There's the Black Cat.
Black Cat,
Black
yeah.
Cat. That's going to be part of it. I think they're going to bring in all these peripheral characters that have been in Spider-Man that Sony still own.
Yeah.
They still have a stake in. So I think they're going to try and revive the whole Sinister Sixth idea, which, you know...
And Sony's in charge of
yeah,
that.
I'd kind of like to see that. I'd like to see a kind of Coen Brothers version of it. You know.
So when we talk about the MCU, we also you could talk about the Sony universe as well, and how that connects in with Spider-Man, bringing in those ancillary characters, like you said.
Yeah.
And that's an IP issue, isn't it? Because there's a whole thorny problem over who owns what and who, you know, it's so thorny that, you know, one can't even be bothered to unpack it. But there's a huge legal entanglement, right, over Spider-Man's and the ancillary characters of that world versus Spider-Man's place within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know in after the Spider-Man movie, there's an attempt to bring those two things together. It will be very interesting to see how those two play against or with one
Because
another.
it's hard to copyright characters that appear in so many different comic books. It's a bit like Quicksilver. You had two Quicksilvers, didn't you?
Yeah.
And they made a huge joke about it in WandaVision, about the old one.
Which worked really well, I thought, actually.
Yeah, I thought he did.
So, Alex, you know, sort of last question. We've talked about how this matters for people, and canon and serious, you know, and you've talked about nostalgia and how these are sort of comes a sort of cultural reference point. You know, we're talking about sort of popular mythology here, aren't we?
Well, that's my theory. I think the only way I can try and square the circle of what we're talking about and try and find some sort of meaning and you know, currency in all these kind of interlocking IPs and, you know, we can, you know, stuff that, you know, frankly represents to me the least interesting sides of fan culture, which largely I love fan culture, but deciding whether or not, you know, the Venom movies are canon or not just makes me want to sort of break out and either cry or yawn, one of the two. But it does sort of make you think about kind of mythology's place within a kind of more, you know, anthropology, civilization kind of structure, and that's how mythology has always functioned. If you think back to sort of ancient Greece, you know, that's Achilles appears in multiple different stories. Sometimes he's one kind of character, sometimes he's another kind of character, and ultimately it only matters in the moment that he's being used and the kind of baggage and association that people have with it. And I wonder, you know, now we're in this digitally saturated age where we're consuming more and more but understanding less and less, whether that's kind of what these figures are doing. Does, you know, what is Batman, what is Spider-Man, other than these kind of emblematic focal points by which we can throw on whatever matters right now in 2020 or 20. I just think I've just travelled back in time. I'm back in the multiverse. But yeah, exactly. Like in 2022. What's been happening?
It feels like they're having the cake and eat it there though, by saying, okay, we've got alternative Spider-Men if you want them. Spider-Man could be what we want him to be in that universe, and then on the other hand we say, but it's all the multiverse, so it is all real. It all matters. It's a very kind of double-edged sword they're playing the whole.
I do blame Star Trek for all this. I think I blame that the Abrahams.
That's true. You know,
let's bring an alternative timeline.
Kelvin universe.
Yeah. Because it meant that had to matter in some way, and I sort of don't think I care too much about the idea that there are 4 different Batmans, 3 different Spider-Mans. You know, how many different Mary Janes in the world. I don't need them all to tie up. I don't need them all to be canon. I just need them all to matter in their own kind of terms.
Absolutely.
And I think that's probably the problem we could face, is that this fetishization of convergence and bringing things together stops things mattering as a singular object.
I think that's been a problem in the comic books for a while. You know, my generation, the number of a comic book mattered, but now they just go back to 0, back to 1, 2, 3, and they just have new kind of limited runs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's the things that have interested me most actually are things like the Ultimates, for example. I know it's quite old now, but that was kind of really like a comment on culture and politics. And it was the Avengers, but it was the kind of Avengers for that moment. And I didn't really care if it went on for 60 issues. I think if it told the story, which it did brilliantly over 2 groups of mini-series, you know, then that's fine, you know, then do a different Avengers after that, you know.
And the ultimate what if, which goes back even further, doesn't it?
Yeah, what if's different. I don't know how you feel about that. I feel it's like, who cares? But that's just me.
Well, I do know, with time drawing to a close, the big what if is how good an Iron Man will Tom Cruise be in Multiverse of Madness.
Oh my God.
That's a potential spoiler there.
He'll be a shorter one.
It'll be a much shorter one, but thanks very much. We could absolutely talk about this all day, and that's, I guess, the point of the multiverse. But I would thank you for coming along. Anyone watching, send in their questions. Do pop a question in the comments below on the YouTube channel, and then we can obviously respond to those over the coming few days.
Sure.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Just to sort of heads up for the topics we'll be covering in future Pop Matters episodes. We'll be looking at Netflix TV series and the importance of representation, looking at sex and sexuality, things such as Sense8 and sex education, with guests including Professor Deborah Shaw. Another topic we'll be looking at is horror in film and television. We have a great strengths in film media communication, looking at horror and pop culture, looking at it as a sort of genre, that's been both appealing and repealed over the years, and a number of guests will be joining us talking about the power of horror to scare, but also to entice. So do make sure you tune in and join us for those topics in the coming months. For now, though, I want to share my thanks again to Dr. David Garland, Dr. Van Norris, and Dr. Alexander Sargent. We've been discussing Disney's Marvel TV series and the MCU because pop matters.